Okay, good morning everyone. I guess I'll try to kick off this session. I'm going to discuss with you some of the issues on poverty and inequality that are sort of a background to a lot of the presentations that we've had over the last few days. But with the focus in my talk on trying to motivate and justify the relevance of looking at sort of trends and patterns and explanations at the local level. So I'm going to be really providing essentially a very descriptive discussion of poverty and inequality trends in two villages in India. And I should start by apologizing in some sense to Martin for doing this, because hang on, it's how do I get the slides to change? Okay, very good, sorry.
Just a page down now.
All right, so I have to apologize, I think, for this presentation. The first paper I ever had published was a paper called Poverty in Inequality, which is one of the villages that we'll be discussing today. It was published in 1991, and this was before I had joined the World Bank. But I joined the World Bank in early 1992, and I set up a meeting with Martin. I was very keen to join the research department, and we had met for lunch. I think it was within the first week that I was at the World Bank. And during the course of our discussion, it turned out that Martin had been the referee on this paper. And so we entered into a whole discussion around village studies and so on. And it turns out that Martin was quite interested in these very, very detailed, granular kind of studies of poverty and other economic processes at the village level. And in fact, he turned me on to a very important, I think, village study that had been undertaken in Bangladesh by Betsy Hartman and James Boyce in the early, or the late 1970s, early 1980s. So it was a very nice conversation, and I think it may have helped me get into the research department, that whole discussion. So I was very pleased with meeting Martin and so on. But then it did mean that for the next 25 years, I used to torment Martin, because every time anything was being discussed, whether it was at the global level, or whether it was about Brazil, or whether it was anything else, it was always, well, what would be happening in Palampur? Would this work in Palampur? Why wouldn't this be true if it wasn't true in Palampur, and so on? He used to get really irritated with me. He used to tell me to run off and go back and do my own thing and not bother him about Palampur. But so, I will be discussing Palampur today, and it's really, I do it with a great deal of affection for those conversations that I had with Martin over those years. And I do think that he may have hopefully approved of this discussion today as well. So what am I going to do today? Well, firstly, I'm going to try very, very quickly to convince you that we should be thinking about poverty analysis and inequality analysis at the very subnational level. That doing this at the very aggregate level is not necessarily the only level at which we should be doing it. I mean, in fact, I think there's to my mind, a little bit of a disturbing tendency to think about poverty and have discussions about poverty measurements and so on at the global level, almost to the neglect of national level poverty debates. And I think at the national level, we should be looking at poverty processes and poverty trends and poverty outcomes at the subnational level. So I'll try to just give you very, very quick a sense of why I think that's potentially important. And then I want to turn to a discussion of two villages and to look at the poverty trends in two villages in India. One of them is Palampur, the village with which I have a very close association, Lanjouw as well. Jean, who was like one of the pioneers in that village, studies alongside Nick Stern and Christopher Bliss. So that's one village we'll discuss. And the second village is one I know I don't know as well, but it's a village that I was associated with in context of collaborating with the author, Satisha Babu, who came to Amsterdam a couple of years ago and spent a year in Amsterdam, and we got to talking, and he's been doing some work in a village in Karnataka called Alabujanahali, and I decided to bring together some of the insights from that village study to parallel those from Palampur. And the context within which I'll be discussing these villages is really focusing on the process of structural transformation. Something that Vinayak mentioned has been a very important part of the story of poverty decline in Bangladesh. And we'll look at a little bit of that process of structural transformation in these two villages. And if time permits, we'll have a few comments on what's been going on in these two villages as a result of the COVID pandemic. So just 2 slides to try to motivate the need to look at poverty and inequality and these distributional outcomes at the subnational level. Here's what we have is a poverty map that has been constructed for West Bengal. This is based on a study that Rinku and I worked on when we were at the World Bank, when I was at the World Bank still, and this is a collaborative effort with Subhashish Gangopalye, based on the census data from 2001 and the NSS data from 2004. And what this picture is just simply showing you, if you take West Bengal, you use NSS data, you can produce an estimate of poverty at the West Bengal level that's judged to be reliable and representative of the state as a whole using the NSS data. With a little bit of luck, if you're a little bit heroic, you can actually disaggregate the NSS data and produce estimates at the district level. But what we would really like to know more about is about poverty and distributional outcomes at the tehsil level, at the block level in West Bengal. And that's something that, if you just look at this map, you see that there is indeed a great deal of heterogeneity that occurs at this very local level. And so we should be interested in trying to understand what are the sources, what are the causes, what's the reason for this great heterogeneity. So that's the first claim of mine to justify why we should be wanting to look at local level outcomes. There's likely to be a great deal of heterogeneity, a lot of different experiences of poverty and inequality at the local level. Here's a second slide. This is from a study that was done by David Garces-Uzanki and Abiruk Mukherjee at ISI. It's based on, this is work involving remote sensing data and NSS survey data from 2004-2011, where the idea is to try to break down inequality in India as a whole into a component that's between tehsils and within tehsils. What share of total inequality in India is due to inequality that occurs at the tehsil level or potentially even lower, and how much of it is due to differences between tehsils. It turns out that nearly 3/4 of total inequality in India could actually be decomposed as occurring within tehsils, not so much between tehsils. Clearly there's great differences between tehsils, but the degree of inequality that occurs within tehsils is very considerable as well. And even in the case of Palampur, you'll find that overall inequality measures, for example, within a village like Palampur, which is tiny as we'll see, is not that different from the inequality that we measure at the level of India as a whole. So there's a lot of heterogeneity that occurs at the very, very local level. We should be trying to understand what are the causes, what are the determinants of this within tehsil, within village inequality. So these are my 2 slides that try to convince you or persuade you that looking at these distributional outcomes at the very local level is something that should be of interest to us. What I want to do now is turn to these 2 village studies. So as I mentioned, Palampur is one of the villages. It's located in UP, and it's a kind of unique survey or study because we have very, very long-term data on the entire village and the village economy that goes back to the 1950s. So this has been a village that's been studied not on a continuous basis, but on a repeated basis since the late 1950s. And all the way through to most recently, we have data from 2022. So we have quite a long range of evidence on Palampur. In Alabujanahali, we have a much shorter time period, but we do have data covering an important period, I think, in the economic development of the village, ranging from 2008 through to 2018, and then again in 2022 as well. So these are panel data. They allow us to actually track households, all households in the village, not just a sample of households. So in that sense, these village studies are different from, say, the famous ICRISAT studies, which we're looking at a sample of households in their respective villages. The background in both of these villages is one of structural transformation being underway, a process of agricultural diversification, agriculture no longer being the sole engine of economic development in those villages, but being the villages are diversifying in terms of the economic activities that are underway. And these two villages, because we have data that extends all the way to 2022, also allow us to say a little bit about what's been going on and what was the impact of the COVID crisis. Palampur, as I mentioned, it's in UP, it's in Moradabad district. It's a smallholder village where wheat and paddy cultivation are the principal crops. Sugarcane is also grown. It has a diverse caste structure. There's 9 different caste groupings in the village, of which 3 are numerically the most significant. Thakurs at the top are kind of a martial caste. Muraos below them in terms of ritual status are traditional cultivators. And at the bottom we have a group called the Jatabs, that are scheduled caste groups. Those are the 3 largest caste groups within this larger, diverse caste structure. It's often tempting to say, well, and this is probably why I was bothering Martin so much, but it's tempting to generalize from what goes on in a little village and sort of say, well, this is true for the world as a whole, and clearly that's not permitted. You're not allowed to do that. But at the same time, it is also the case that a village like Palampur is not particularly unusual in any obvious way, and so it allows you to kind of use it somewhat as a benchmark against which to compare things. The village was studied in these different years: 1957, 1962, 74, 83, 93, 2008, 2015, and then again 2022. And those years varied in terms of the quality of the harvest. Some years there was drought, some years there was pest attacks, and so on. Some years there was a bumper harvest, and so on. So there's a good deal of variability from year to year in the economic fortunes of the village. And the most complete data that we have are, in terms of income data, which is what I'll be focusing on, are for the years 1957, 62, 74, 83, and 2008. So we don't have really up-to-date, very complete income data, although I will say a little bit about poverty numbers in 2022. But the most complete income data, and that's what I'll focus on here, are from those years that I just mentioned. The population of Palampur, it's a small village. It started with about 500 people in the village in 1957. It had grown to something like 1,300 by 2015. It's a little bit more than that now in 2022. I can't remember off the top of my head what it is in the most recent survey. One of the things that's interesting, and we often get questions about, is migration. How do we deal with the fact that people have left the village? And they certainly have. There have been some households that have left the village over time, but it's not been a really major process. And not one of the things that really jumps out at you. The village is fairly cohesive and stayed reasonably self-contained in a sense. There has been some migration, and we have made some efforts to follow them, and we have looked into what happens to the migrating households. One of the things that we emphasize and that we think should receive perhaps a little bit more attention is that wholesale migration out of the village is not so necessary, because a lot of what goes on in the village is commuting out of the village. So people commute out of the village, they work in a nearby town or nearby factory, and then they return to the village. So the need to actually fully migrate from the village is not as pressing as it might be in other parts of India. Yeah, here are the three castes that I was focusing on. I've sort of ranked them in terms of sort of the status in the village. Thakurs are a traditionally landowning caste. They have a strong association with sort of martial activities, policemen, military, and so on. The Muraos just below them are very active cultivators, but those who have perhaps been most active and most rapid in adopting some of the green revolution technologies that I'll mention in a few minutes. And then the Jatabs are at the bottom, and they were historically the poorest and have remained the poorest, although there's been some interesting changes that have occurred over the recent decades as well amongst the Jatabs. Now, focusing on structural transformation, I'm obviously aware of the time, so I can't really go into the great detail that we have on this process in Palampur, but just to give you a quick feel for what's been going on. The village in 1957 was largely rain-fed. There wasn't that much irrigation that was going on. The village now is fully irrigated. There's been basically drawing groundwater rather than, say, canal irrigation. It's groundwater extraction that results in irrigation. This has been accompanied by sort of traditional green, or the well-known green revolution, where we're talking about new yields, new variety of seeds, particularly wheat and rice and sugarcane and so on, and sort of intensive input use, fertilizers, pesticides, and so on. And this has resulted in, as you can see, for example, with wheat yields, that they've just exploded over time. There's double cropping, in some cases even triple cropping, that goes on within the village now. So one given unit of land is able to just generate a great deal more output than it used to. And that's been very important because, as we saw in the previous slides, there has been this population growth in the village. And so, the village land is fixed, the population is growing, per capita land availability is declining as a result, but because of the Green Revolution, the land productivity has improved tremendously as well. That's been one of the major trends that has occurred in the village. A huge part of the story of economic development in Kuala Lumpur is just this intensification of agriculture. But alongside this intensification of agriculture has been a diversification of the village economy out of agriculture. So there's been a real explosion of employment in the non-agricultural sector, non-farm sector. I mentioned already that villagers are beginning to commute. And that's a process that started, I guess, already in the 1970s, and it's been kind of just snowballing over time. So there's been a large number of villagers that leave the house, leave the village and work outside the village, return. Sometimes they leave for periods at a time, sometimes it's daily commuting. There is a train track that runs nearby Kuala Lumpur, which has historically been a useful way of getting out of the village to commute. Nowadays, there's also a lot of motorcycles, and there's even a few vehicles in the village, so people can commute on that basis as well. A lot of employment is occurring in it's mainly low productivity non-agricultural activities. A lot of sort of construction work, brick making, so on. Some factory work. There's a nearby town called Chandosi, and then a larger city that's not too far away, Moradabad. So people find work in those towns in a variety of activities. The railways, the steel polish shops, marble factories, a variety of different activities. We haven't found education to be a huge driver of that non-farm employment. So it's not really education-intensive employment. It's largely sort of manual labor, but remunerative, and compared to agriculture, and maybe for many people, very attractive alternative source of income. In terms of the importance of non-agricultural or non-farm income in the village, you can see it was like 13% of the village income came from non-farm sources in the 50s. By 2008, 2009, it was 46%, nearly 50%. And it's higher than that, obviously, now as well. I'll do 5 more minutes. Okay, moving along. What's happened to poverty? Poverty has fallen impressively in Kuala Lumpur. Income is our main measure that we've been using of economic welfare, but also we have some observations on consumption, and both of them tell a story of a fairly significant poverty decline. It's fallen from like 85% to 38% in income terms over the period up until 2008, 2009. So this process of structural transformation has yielded, I think what Vinayak was also referring to in Bangladesh, poverty decline in rural areas in a way that has been quite important. The story on inequality is one, it's a little bit more mixed. There hasn't been a linear trend in inequality, but we do observe that by 2008, 2009, inequality was sort of at a peak. It's never been higher, measured at a higher level than what was measured in 2008, 2009. So it was showing an upward trend, okay? Now, we've done a little bit of work to try to probe some of those trends. One of the obvious questions is whether this process of non-farm diversification, it may be good for poverty reduction, but is it also resulting in rising inequality? And there's good reasons to think that if you simply decompose inequality and you look at it by sources of income, you do find that the non-farm sector is really contributing to an increasing extent to overall inequality. And overall inequality has been rising. On the other hand, it's worth thinking a little bit about what might have been the counterfactual of what would have happened to Kuala Lumpur if the non-farm sector hadn't emerged. We've done some kind of simulation analysis. When you take into account that you've got a fixed amount of land, you've got agricultural intensification, but that's also sort of declining in the extent to which it's improving productivity of the land. And you've got a growing population. You could well imagine that in the absence of the non-farm diversification process, inequality might also have evolved in a particular direction. We did some simulation exercise where we tried to explore that, and it actually found that the absence of non-farm employment might actually have resulted in more inequality in the village rather than less. So while on the one hand it seems like this diversification is generating bigger differences between households, it may also have been that in the absence of this non-farm diversification, there would have been even more accentuation of inequalities, with the landless being unable to reap a remuneration or a living subsistence level from their declining per capita land holdings. And possibly we have a phenomenon that we observe in Palampur of reverse tenancy, with the large landowners leasing inland from the marginal landowners. You could imagine inequality might actually have increased even further. So it's something to think about when we try to assess whether non-farm diversification and structural transformation is good or bad for inequality. It's not completely clear. This actually echoes also with some of the other village studies that have been carried out in India, looking at the experience in different parts of the world. Another process that we did track over time was that in the process of transformation in Palampur, there was clear evidence over a certain number of years, in the early years of the study, of the scheduled caste, these jatabs, falling further behind from the rest of the village, resulting almost in what we call a partitioning of the income distribution, such that the richest jatab was still poorer than the poorest non-jatab villager in the village. It was moving in that direction. They were falling further behind. And then when the non-farm diversification process sort of kicked in, we saw that reversing, with the jatabs now returning and catching up with the rest of the village population. They still cluster at the bottom end of the income distribution, but are now, there's been significant decline in poverty in amongst that group as well. So that's been an interesting process that we clearly link to this availability of non-farm employment that is also becoming available to the scheduled castes in the village. So that was the Palampur study. Very quickly about Alabujana in 2 minutes. So this is a study that was carried out by Satisha Banur, as I mentioned earlier. It's located in Karnataka, in the Mandya district. It has data, that census data on the village that canvassed literally every household in the village, starting in 2008 and extending through to 2022. It's a very similar village in many respects to Palampur. It's also smallholder farming. Sugarcane is the main sort of cash crop there. It relies differently from Palampur on migrant labor to do sort of harvesting and so on. It has also a diverse caste structure, but in this particular village, there's one caste, the caste that's sort of at the top of the village status, that dominates numerically. That's called the Vocaliga caste, or the traditional cultivators. There's a small scheduled caste, again at the bottom of the hierarchy, representing around 11%, and a few other smallish caste groups in the village. I'm not sure if you can see this. The village population has increased from something like 1,200 in 2008, very similar to Palampur at that time, to it's declined a little bit in fact to 1,194 by 2018. In many ways, as I mentioned, the Vocaligas are at the top and the scheduled castes are at the bottom. It's essentially a summary of the village characteristics. Structural transformation was also a big part of the story in Alabujana. Total employment, non-farm represents about 33%, or a third of total employment in the village. So still, agriculture is still dominant, but non-farm employment is very important. And unlike Palampur, the non-farm sector in Alabujana is much more in the direction of sort of regular salaried employment. That probably has something to do with the location of the village. It's not that far from Bangalore, it's not that far from the district capital, and there is a sort of remunerative employment opportunities that the villagers have been able to avail. And so there's quite a few family members that then work in these nearby cities with regular employment. Again, unsurprisingly, the Vocaligas at the top are the ones that have gotten the best, most secure employment, and the scheduled castes relatively low-skilled employment in the vicinity of the village rather than in Bangalore, for example. Agriculture has intensified in a similar way that we saw in Palampur, with increased input use, intensification. One of the issues in Lanjouw is that this input use has really expanded dramatically, but the prices of these inputs also rose quite sharply during this time period. And this actually resulted in declining or containing real income growth from agriculture for those households that were engaged in really intensive agriculture. Per capita incomes grew over this time period, but what we have is a very interesting process in Lanjouw where incomes grew, inequality fell, and poverty actually increased. And you think about it, it doesn't seem like it makes any sense, but when you look at the specifics of what happened in Lanjouw, at least a plausible story can be told. Essentially, we had these scheduled castes at the very bottom end of the income distribution, and they saw an increase in employment outside the village and an increase in their incomes. But there's between them and the group at the top, there was a sort of an interim group, a middling group, and they actually saw declining incomes to some extent. And the vocaligas at the top were also able to benefit, and they saw rising incomes as well. So what you have is a kind of squeezing of the income distribution, with the very bottom end sort of catching up with the rest, a few in the middle dropping across the poverty line, and then the sort of rich enjoying economic growth. This story becomes a little bit more plausible when you realize that when you measure poverty using the squared poverty gap, which is very sensitive to poverty amongst the very poor, and there you see actually poverty did decline. So the poverty increase that we're documenting here is just a question of the headcount rate, where the numbers of people crossing the poverty line rather than sort of living standards of the poor getting worse off as a whole. But that seems to be the story in Lanjouw. We have the stories of incomes. This substantiation here of my story is that you can see that for this one group here, they had negative income growth between 2008 and 2018-19, whereas most people in that time period saw significant growth of incomes, in particular the scheduled caste groups. But this one middle group saw some decline in their incomes. So that's really the story of structural transformation that I wanted to convey very, very quickly in these two villages. I'm running out of time. We do have some observations on what happened to these two villages in the face of COVID. I don't have any real surprises there. I think just to give you a very quick summary of what we saw in both villages, we saw a significant return to the village from these people who had been working outside the village. These jobs in the non-farm sector, many of them were lost. Many of the villagers returned to the village, either were without work or they ended up working on their families' fields. They returned to agriculture. Both villages saw significant reductions in incomes during the COVID period. But what we also see that both villages did see significant benefits from state-level interventions in the village. So there was food that was distributed, in some cases cash was distributed. In Palampur, the NREGA program was functioning and did actually provide at least some employment to villagers. So while things got worse very clearly in both villages, they may well have gotten even, would have been a lot worse even if there hadn't been some kind of state intervention. And so that's something that is kind of reassuring and encouraging out of the experience of these two villages. But I won't go any further. We could probably return to this or possibly return to this if there's questions, but I'll finish here. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Peter. We'll collect some questions, maybe 3.
I'm trying to understand the reason for the development of these villages. What is the prime mover? Is it agrarian-led development type of thing? Then my second question would be about non-food consumption. Since you have consumption data, I think you can get non-food consumption as such. Interesting.
Shekhar.
So Peter, since you have really intimate knowledge about the village, given how long Nick and you and others have been pursuing this, this is a census of the village, right, in effect? So there's a longitudinal panel right here. Can we use that structure of the data for much more powerful analysis? Because the only other national longitudinal panel is the IHDS. but that comes only once in 5-7 years. So have you explored that a little bit in terms of how you can push the data even further? And secondly, given that again you have such intimate knowledge of the village and its households, could you not consider doing a much more higher frequency data collection using, for example, telephones and telephone surveying? Because you're known, they know you, you know them. And that might be actually a very fruitful way of further expanding this work.
So last question here, and then I think.
I'm curious about the role of investment in human capital as a sort of pathway to upward mobility, and in the comparison between the two villages, it seems like that there's returns to education that are demand driven by this nearby economic activity in the cities, whereas as I understand in Palampur it was absent, it was more unskilled, non-farmer. And so do you see any distribution impact or investment in education as a pathway to upward mobility or differences in sort of investment in the different socioeconomic groups?
All right, I'll try to quickly respond to these questions. The first one on the process of the prime movers in these two villages. What has been the story of agrarian change? I mean, I think this is like the big question. This is, I think, what prompted Nick Stern and Christopher Bliss to go to Palampur in the early 1970s to try to understand sort of the role of agriculture and so on, and what was going to be the impact of the Green Revolution and so on. And I think one of our answers is that indeed this Green Revolution has had a huge impact in a village like Palampur. But then we also have this process of structural transformation, of diversification out of agriculture, which from the village perspective you really can see as kind of an exogenous change. It's something that the village didn't generate, it came from outside. I have my own and I'll just mention it. I have a real hypothesis or conjecture that I think would actually be potentially valuable, and it's kind of inspired by a book by Pankaj Mishra called Butter, Chicken, and Ludhiana. I don't know if any of you have come across this book. It's a wonderful book. But in it, he describes these small towns in India and how historically they've been overlooked by, say, urban planners, and they do really badly in terms of availability of basic infrastructure and so on. But he documents this real energy in these villages. And he documents how these villages really should be nurtured and they could really generate and deliver a real push to economic development in India. And the point that I would make is that I think that should be a very important part of a rural strategy, because I think these small towns, as we see in Palampur and Bujanahalli, these small towns are really valuable and really important in providing income support, income opportunities to rural households. It doesn't involve people migrating to urban areas. It's this kind of notion that there's this urban-rural migration process, and that's the only way that it works. What you can have is a diversification of the rural economy where rural households are involved in these non-agricultural activities alongside cultivation activities. They just diversify their family's activities, their portfolio of activities into both cultivation and non-cultivation. And I think these small towns can potentially offer this really important route through which to promote that. So that's a plug I would make, is that I think that might be an important potential driver of rural development alongside technological change in agriculture and so on. Turning to Shekhar's question, yes, we have done. I mean, we've written a book that came out in 2018 in which we've done a huge amount of analysis and taken a great deal of advantage of the availability of panel data. And we looked at mobility questions and asking questions both in terms of intra-generation but even intergenerational mobility. The Palampur study is really interesting in the sense that because we have such a long time period, we actually have information across two entire generations. If you think of the first 25 years of the survey period and then the second 25 years as being representing two completely different generations, and yet we can track the whole dynasties, the families over that entire time period. And we've done a little bit of work, and we've been able to replicate the famous Gatsby curve that people have commented on in the context of national intergenerational mobility. We actually can document a very similar process in Palampur in the sense that as the villages become more unequal, intergenerational mobility has declined. It's kind of a counterintuitive in the face of the structural transformation story that we've been telling, but it seems to be, at least in the data that we have, seems to be supported in the Palampur context as well. So yes, indeed, this mobility business is really important. With respect to the more high-frequency data, we haven't been doing it in a really systematic way, but we are doing it because Lanjouw has been going to Palampur for visits, revisits, and you walk into the village, you know most of the villagers, you talk to the villagers and you ask them what's the current agricultural wage rate, or what are people doing this year? So what's been the impact of the price changes in the menta markets, which was a crop that our villagers were diversifying into at one point, and then quickly moved back out of once the volatility of those price changes became revealed. But so there's a lot of kind of regular data collection that happens, although we haven't been doing it in a real systematic way. One thing we've been concerned about, of course, is not to go into the village too much, to disrupt the village too much by being in there, because you start worrying about these Hawthorne effects and so on that would otherwise potentially contaminate the findings to a great extent. I mean, probably they already are affected to some extent, but you want to try to minimize that. Finally, on education, we found in Palampur that it's actually interesting. I said that Palampur does not seem to be an exceptional village in any way. But yesterday, Lanjouw, Jean, and I were talking on the boat trip, and we think maybe we should revise that, because it does seem to be an exceptional village in the sense of how non-functional some of the village institutions are, even compared to some of the neighboring villages. So the school, the history of the school in Palampur has just been one, up and down. The school gets built, teachers get sent out. The next visit takes place, the school is completely fallen apart. The teachers are no longer there. The kids are roaming around. The next visit, there's a school of some kind, an informal school back up and running. The next visit is back to not. The last visit we went to in 2022, the school, one of the classrooms was full of kids. The teachers were there. The midday meal was being prepared. We met some of the kids in the village we were talking to afterwards. They were learning English. They were going to a nearby private school. You got the impression there was real momentum behind this expansion of education in the village. I just don't know whether the next visit we take, we'll find that that's all collapsed again, or whether that'll actually really taken off. Ali is a contrasting experience, because their education seems to have really been a huge part of the story of its rising affluence. All these non-farm jobs that the villagers are getting to, many of them are actually in service sector, education-intensive, relatively education-intensive occupations. And so it seems to have a totally, and the school seems to be functioning. There's people with high-level degrees and so on. And that seems to be quite a different story from what we've seen in Palampur. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter.